first guest this week is Dr. John Quinn, an attorney and former state representative who also serves as director of public interest law and community partnerships at the law school at UMass Dartmouth. We're speaking with Mr. Quinn in a different capacity today. He's also the chairman of the New England Regional Fisheries Management Council. John, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me, Jim, in a different capacity than years past.
Yes, that's true. For those who don't know, John, what is the New England Regional Fisheries Management Council?
Sure. The New England Fisheries Council is created under the Magnuson Act, the federal law that passed in 1976 to manage the fishery stocks across, there are 8 regions in the United States. So we're the New England component made up of the New England states. We manage, I think, 28 different species from Maine to Rhode Island.
And the councils exist in all areas where commercial fishing exists, right? Basically around the country.
Correct. Yep. There's 8 of them. In fact, we have a couple of annual meetings. We just hosted the last one in Gloucester in May, but there's 8 regional councils. The ones that are probably the easy ones to think of would be the South Atlantic, which is Florida and the neighboring states. Hawaii has got their own, and Alaska. So those are the obvious ones, but there's down in Texas, and so there's 8 in total. In the Mid-Atlantic one as well, we work with Virginia area.
And the New England Council, how often does that meet, and where does it meet?
Sure. Yeah, we meet as a full council 5 times a year, and we meet, ironically, 1 in each New England state. So we meet. It's a 3-day meeting 5 times a year. So we've met all over the place, but I just got back from Portland, Maine, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Spartan, Massachusetts. Has changed a little bit. We were in Gloucester coming up this year. We've been down the Cape.
You've been in Fairhaven in the past.
Been in Fairhaven in the past,
yep.
Prior to my tenure. Mystic, Connecticut, and Newport, Rhode Island.
All right, so you've hit all the high spots. Basically, the council sets the conditions whereby commercial fishing can happen. Open fishing areas, closing areas, partial closed areas. These decisions really are not made on a whim. Give us an idea about how those deliberations take place.
To make the analogy, it's a little bit similar to the state legislature in that we have subcommittees on different topics. People raise issues that they want addressed, and then we have what they call the SSC, the Science and Statistical Committee. They do the scientific work up for us. We also work with the Northeast Science Center, does a lot of the science work in Woods Hole, is the local one for this region. And then ultimately, we, through a course of public hearings, interacting with stakeholders, interacting with the scientific community, we make recommendations to subcommittees to the full council, and we act on them. Give you a perfect example. Yesterday, we acted on this, or partially acted on this coral amendment to protect corals down off of Rhode Island and south in this monument area, which has been in the news somewhat. So we've had hearings, public hearings, scientific discussions. Finally, yesterday, we said, this is what we think we ought to do in a portion of it. We ultimately didn't finish that work yesterday. But so it's opening, closing, how many fish you can land, what's the assessment, how many fish are out there. And so it's actually a rather complicated process and a lot of science involved and certainly policy as well.
I look at it and say, boy, that's a kind of a thankless job. And I say that because you have to walk a fine line between fishermen and environmentalists who are always at you guys, both sides. The fishermen think you never do enough for them. The environmentalists also think you don't do much for them. And so there's always that pull and tug going on.
Absolutely. I'll just give you one brief anecdote. When I first got appointed several years ago, we had a special meeting to cut the cod quota in December, right before Christmas. And at that point, there was no question that it should have been done. But sitting there a couple of weeks before Christmas with fishermen in the audience, literally in tears, I said to myself, what the heck am I doing here? I'm trying to help people, not hurt people. So it's, I wouldn't say thankless. I think it's challenging. Oftentimes people want to be on the sidelines and say, why didn't this happen? He should have done that. Why didn't they do that? Oh, how come they did that? I'd like to think I'm in the trenches trying to work on some very important policy issues for this region.
You're listening to WBSM's Townsquare Media, Townsquare Sunday, I should say. My guest is John Quinn, the chairman of the New England Fisheries Management Council. John, I want to talk to you about this cod situation. I remember those meetings very well. It is the most popular fish in New England, and it has all, or at least then, all but disappeared. What's the status of that stock now?
Sure. It's, again, this tug and pull between the different things. The scientists say it's at 3 to 4% of what it actually should be as far as a biomass, how many fish are out there. Fishermen say it's dramatically higher. And so you've got this, difference of opinion. You may have seen in the news that the state of Massachusetts has now started their own survey, led by the Department of Marine Science, the Marine Fisheries. They're trying to, make sense of the dramatically different view of what's out there. And again, getting back, we're at a meeting and a scientist says there's no fish out there, and then 3 fishermen say it's the most I've ever seen. I've been fishing for 30 years. So how do you square those two statements? And they happen regularly, and so it's a very, very challenging issue.
It comes down to science. And the criticism of the federal science is that it's not really up to date. There's a lag time when you get it. I mean, how do you resolve this? You try and be fair to everybody.
Yeah, I think it's a balancing act. I mean, you're trying to, as I said, we've got this SSC, the Scientific and Statistical Committee. They set a ceiling of what we can allow somebody to fish. So they work up the science, and then they say, okay, council, you can make the management decisions, but you can go no higher than X, just to make 100 pounds. So we're restricted within that area beyond which the group of scientists that the council appoints. So it's not, somebody, environmental. Actually, it's made up of a cross section of types of scientists, but Dan Georgiana from SMAS is on there, for example. Steve Cadron's on there from SMAS. So there's a balanced approach to the science, but we're set a ceiling as to what we can allow people to fish.
All right. No matter what the council does with fish, I think those involved in the New Bedford waterfront have always said, we still got the scallops, and that'll always keep the port healthy. Are changes coming for scallopers?
I don't see it in the short term now. I think it's been a very well-managed stock. It's interesting that, people want to blame the council or the management for the cod problem, but they don't want to say because of sound management practices, the scallops are booming. So I think in the scallop industry, there's been great engagement. SMAS certainly has been involved in doing some of the surveys. We set, they call it a research set-aside. They take a portion of each trip to do additional research. That equates to almost $15 million a year of scallop-specific research that's done by taking money off the top of each trip. So it's a very well-managed species. The stock is healthy now, but again, you're that balance. The old bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. Do you want to catch more now, or do you want to have a consistent catch over time? So it's, capitalism, environmentalism, all, stirred up in the same pot. But I think it's well managed. It's doing very well. It's another good year this year, and I like to brag at these national meetings, the scallop capital of the world I'm from, and the highest grossing port in the world. Because you say that to people from, in the country, you say that to people from Hawaii or Alaska who think, they're the top dogs. Hey, it's our port here in New Bedford. So it's well known around the country.
2 big issues facing the Port of New Bedford. One is the fate of the fishing licenses owned by the codfather, Carlos Rafael. Mr. Rafael has been found guilty of conspiracy. Frankly, this decision will be made by a federal judge, I guess, Judge Young. I'm not asking you to upstage the judge, John, but I am asking you, what are your thoughts on those licenses?
Sure. I mean, I think a couple of things. One, I know Mayor Mitchell came out with a proposal yesterday, and he certainly, arguing on behalf of the of New Bedford of how this should be divvied up, or
In essence, the licenses should be sold to interested parties in our region here in the South Coast.
Right. Yeah, and that economic impact generally should be kept in New Bedford. Now, as I said at the outset, we've got a New England Council, and the current regulations in place are that if licenses are forfeited, they get redistributed amongst the remaining people in the industry. So a person from Maine or New Hampshire has got a little different take on what should happen to those licenses. So it's a very complicated thing. I think, Mayor Mitchell trying to keep it here. My position is I want to let the process work. I've talked, several times with John Bullard, who, in the hierarchy is basically the supervisor of two of these councils, the two Northeast ones. We've got regulations in place that we made, the New England Council, and the agency and the criminal courts are going to now apply those. So if we wanted to make any changes, we got to wait and see. So it's interesting. The council has been pressured by a lot of people to take a position on this, and we've chosen not to because we passed regulations. We're not in the enforcement of them. We want to let the process work and let the federal judge decide on these. And then if going forward we want to tweak these regulations, that would be the time that we would do something, but not when something's pending.
Has Judge Young asked the council or Mr. Bullard about regulations? Do you have any idea about that?
Have not asked us at all directly. I couldn't speak for Mr. Bullard, but it's a there's criminal components to this, there's civil components to it, so it's a where the council's chosen to not take a position on it. We've got regulations in place that we passed, and let's see how they work it out. But again, I think Mayor Mitchell's doing the right thing, trying to advocate for his port, this region. Other people are advocating, hey, wait a minute, this stuff should go back from whence it came in some instances. So be interesting how they structure this decision, which I think right now is scheduled for the end of July.
A year or so before President Obama left office, he designated a portion of the Atlantic Ocean, the northern Atlantic Ocean, as a monument, as a place to protect sea life. That includes fish. And I don't know if he banned all the fishing there, but
he did.
He did. Okay, so clearly that left New England fishermen, they had to change their life a lot. So as you view this now, the Trump administration has promised to take a look at all these designations. I guess you've been a part of that?
Yes, and that's something I can elaborate a little bit more detail on because the council did take a position on that. As I said earlier, there's 8 councils, and we had a national meeting in May, and ironically, I was running the meeting because we were the hosts of New England, but we took a position that the council should be involved in this review. Under the executive order, Secretary Zinke, the new Secretary of Interior, and Secretary Ross, the new Secretary of Commerce, have until August the 24th to review this. Subsequent to that federal meeting yesterday, the New England Council took a position which says, in simple terms, we want the law followed, which is that the Magnuson-Stevens Act created these councils to regulate fishing. We've got this whole complex process that we just went through with public input and this Coral Amendment that we dealt with yesterday. We've been working on it for several years in that exact region. So we're doing this through stakeholder involvement, scientific involvement. It wasn't, I don't know, it's not criticism, but it was kind of done unilaterally. There was one meeting in Providence that fishermen were invited. They had a couple of meetings at the White House. They had one at the Whaling Museum, and that was it. We've had years of hearings and analysis. So we want the Magnuson-Stevens Act to apply, which says that the councils should regulate fishing in these areas. So I had the good fortune last Friday to actually meet with Secretary Zinke, who's done a tour of some of these monuments. I was there with Ed Washburn representing New Bedford, and I said the same thing. I say, what do we exist for if we're not going to regulate fishing? So, as I said, I'd stay tuned on that. The August 24th, I think, is this review is going to be completed. That's the timeline. It'll be interesting to see what comes out of that.
John, our time is up. Thank you very much. Thanks for the update on the monument thing. We'll keep watching that, and I'm sure we'll be speaking with you again about that as the decisions come down here.
Very good. Thank you very much for having me.
All right, John, thanks. We'll be right back in just a moment.